The Second Crusade military failure and political consequences. Introduction. The historical context of the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, was one of the most significant military and religious events of the 12th century. It was launched in response to the fall of the county of Edessa in 1144 to Imad ad-Din Zengi, an event that shocked Christendom and raised fears about the decline of Crusader presence in the Levant. This crusade was notable for being the first since the First Crusade to involve European kings, led by Louis VII of France and Conrad III of the Holy Roman Empire, under the spiritual guidance of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Immediate causes of the crusade. The fall of Edessa, 1144. The county of Edessa was the first Crusader state to be established, 1098, and the first to fall. Zengi's recapture of the city after a month-long siege exposed Crusader vulnerability. The papal call to arms. In 1145, Pope Eugene III issued the bull Quantum Predecessors, calling for a new crusade and offering the same spiritual incentives as Urban II had during the First Crusade. Religious propaganda. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux launched an intense preaching campaign across France and Germany, using his rhetorical skill to persuade thousands to take up the cross. Preparations and the march to the east. The armies. The German forces, led by Conrad III, they departed in May 1147 via the Balkans. The French forces, led by Louis VII, they set out in June 1147. Logistical challenges. The German troops faced Byzantine resistance in the Balkans due to undisciplined behavior. Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos refused full support, weakening the alliance. Major military events. The disaster at Dorylaeum, October 1147. The German army was ambushed by Seljuk forces near Dorylaeum, the same site where Crusaders had triumphed in the First Crusade. Most of their forces were annihilated. The failed siege of Damascus, July 1148. After the remnants of both armies reached Jerusalem, Crusader leaders decided to attack Damascus, despite its previous alliance with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The siege collapsed after just 4 days due to poor strategic planning. Nur ad-Din Zengi's reinforcements. Infighting among Crusaders over who would rule the city if it fell. Consequences and repercussions. Military impact. Strengthening of the Zengids. The Crusader failure paved the way for Nur ad-Din and later Saladin to rise. Loss of Crusader prestige. The myth of Crusader invincibility was shattered. Political fallout. Deterioration of relations with Byzantium. Crusaders accused Emperor Manuel of betrayal. Shift in Crusader strategy. Attention later turned toward Egypt as a strategic target. Religious consequences. Crisis in crusading ideology. Questions arose about the legitimacy of holy violence and of popular crusades. Future campaigns became more organized under royal leadership. Conclusion. Lessons from the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade became a textbook example of strategic failure due to lack of coordination among European forces. Misjudgment of political alliances in the Levant. Overestimation of military capabilities. The campaign proved that the success of the First Crusade was an exception rather than the rule. It reshaped the balance of power in favor of Muslim forces, leading to the eventual fall of Jerusalem at the Battle of Hattin, 1187. It also revealed deep divisions within Christendom, between Byzantium and the West, and between resident Crusaders and new arrivals. The fall of Edessa. The spark that ignited the Second Crusade. Narrative style. The city was known to them as Edessa, or Al-Ruha to the Muslims. It stood on the fringes of Mesopotamia, surrounded by fertile plains and rugged mountains. The first Crusader state to be founded, 1098, it was also the most isolated and vulnerable. Ruled first by Baldwin I and then his successors, it remained trapped between the Seljuks to the east, the Byzantines to the north, and distrustful Armenian neighbors. Imad ad-Din Zengi. The hungry wolf. Meanwhile, Imad ad-Din Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, had set his sights westward. Ambitious and ruthless, he knew that capturing Edessa would make him a hero in the Muslim world. On a cold December night in 1144, his army slithered like a serpent through the rocks. The city was besieged, its defenses strained. Inside the walls, Count Jocelyn II was away, visiting Armenian allies. Only a small garrison and terrified clergy remained. Edessa held out for a month, but its walls could not last. At dawn, Zengi's men stormed in. Blood ran through the streets as the last Crusader stronghold in the region fell. The cry that shook Europe. News of Edessa's fall was not just a military defeat, it was a spiritual shock. How had the First Crusader state collapsed so easily? In Rome, Pope Eugene III trembled. In France, King Louis VII heard whispers, "This is God's punishment for our sins." But no one stirred European hearts like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the monk whose words burned like fire. Standing in castle courtyards and cathedrals, he roared, "Christians! The Turks have taken Edessa, slaughtered our brothers, and defiled the holy places. Where is your zeal? Where is your faith? If you do not act now, all that your ancestors built will crumble." His sermons were a tempest, igniting thousands. Even Louis VII, plagued by guilt after a bloody conflict in France, vowed to seek redemption by taking the cross. The kings and their armies, Europe united under the cross once more. But this time, it was not a rabble of peasants, it was organized armies led by kings. Conrad III, the German emperor, a hardened but impulsive warrior. Louis VII, the pious but militarily inexperienced king of France. The armies marched in the spring of 1147, crossing the Balkans where the Byzantines watched warily. Emperor Manuel Comnenos did not trust them. These were the same men who had carved Crusader states from Byzantine lands before. Still, he let them pass, extracting promises not to attack his territories. Disaster strikes. The Germans met catastrophe first. At the Battle of Dorylaeum, Seljuk archers ambushed them. Arrows fell like rain, cavalry tore through their ranks. Conrad III was crushed, retreating to Nicaea with shattered remnants of his army. The French fared no better. Their march across Anatolia became a nightmare. Starvation, thirst, and Seljuk raids whittled them down. They reached Antioch exhausted, where Princess Constance received them. But disputes between Louis VII and Prince Raymond of Antioch over strategy shattered their alliance. The siege that became a scandal in the end. The Crusaders made a baffling decision: attack Damascus, a former ally. The siege in July 1148 was a disaster. They failed to breach the walls, then rumors spread that some nobles had taken bribes to withdraw. After just 4 days, they abandoned the siege. The humiliation was total. Louis VII and Conrad III returned to Europe in disgrace, while Muslims across the Levant learned one clear lesson: the Crusaders were not invincible. The outcome, the beginning of the end. The Second Crusade was but a chapter in a greater tragedy. It revealed Crusader disunity and inability to cooperate, the rise of Nur ad-Din Zengi, who would later unite the Muslim world, the countdown to Jerusalem's fall, which would come just 40 years later at Hattin, and so, the crusade ended as it began, in blood, disappointment, and a dream shattered against the rocks of reality. The harsh winter that changed the fate of the world. On a cold December night in 1144, as the citizens of Edessa slept soundly, the guards on the city walls watched with growing unease as torchlights flickered in the distant plains. Little did they know these flames carried their doom: the fall of the first stronghold. Imad ad-Din Zengi, the handsome Turkish commander with piercing eyes, had spent years planning this moment. Standing on a high hill observing his target, he watched his soldiers move like serpents in the darkness. "Today I will restore Islam's honor," he whispered to himself. Inside the city, Count Jocelyn too was feasting in his castle, unaware his fortunes were about to turn. When the first alarm cries rang out, he rushed to the walls to find Turkish arrows falling like locusts. "Where are the garrison troops?" he shouted in panic, then remembered he'd sent most of his forces away on a mission, the cry that shook Europe months later. In the Clairvaux Abbey in France, Saint Bernard read the letter that would change history. Edessa had fallen. His hands trembled as he read the bloody details. "We must act," he said hoarsely, his eyes burning with determination. In King Louis VII Palace, the young monarch tossed and turned in bed, haunted by nightmares of the massacres he'd heard about. "This is a sign from God," he told his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine at dawn. "I must atone for my sins by taking the cross." The army's march in May 1147, Conrad III, the German emperor, left Regensburg at the head of a massive army. Knights in shining armor, soldiers bearing crosses, but arrogance filled Conrad's heart. "We'll crush these Turks like glass," he told his advisors. That June, Louis VII departed Paris amid cheering crowds. Eleanor accompanied him, wearing a stylish masculine outfit that astonished the court. "I'll be a thorn in the Muslims' side," she proudly told the ladies of the court. Disaster begins when the Germans reached Asia Minor. The heat was unbearable. In the valley of Dorylaeum, where Crusaders had triumphed 50 years earlier, ambushes awaited. Suddenly, arrows rained down from surrounding hills. Treachery! Conrad cried as his horse fell beneath the onslaught. Meanwhile, the French suffered from thirst in the Anatolian deserts. Water! Water! Soldiers screamed as they fell one by one. Louis VII, who'd lost a third of his army, knelt praying, "Lord, why do you test us so?" Betrayal at Damascus. When the exhausted forces reached Jerusalem, their decision to attack Damascus was a shot in the dark. Its rich and weak, greedy nobles convinced them. But as the siege began, young Nur ad-Din Zengi appeared with a relief force. In the Crusader command tent, plots swirled. "They offered us gold to withdraw," a baron whispered. Feverish Louis VII couldn't distinguish truth from deception. On the fifth morning, Damascenes woke to find the Crusader armies had vanished. Return with shame. When Louis VII returned to France after 2 years, his wife Eleanor refused to share his ship. "You were a failed leader," she coldly told him before sailing separately. In Europe, people mocked the campaign that lost everything. Meanwhile in the east, Nur ad-Din Zengi built a new mosque in Edessa. "This is just the beginning," he told his advisors, his gaze fixed on distant Jerusalem. Lessons from crushing failure. 20 years later, Saladin, Nur ad-Din's protégé, sat in his tent outside besieged Jerusalem's walls. "We learned from their mistakes," he told his commanders. "Unite, avoid arrogance, know your land." The next day, his armies would enter the Holy City, drawing the curtain on one of the Middle Age's greatest tragedies. Thus ended the Second Crusade, not with a thunderous roar, but with the whimpers of disappointed kings and Muslim leaders who learned victory comes not from numbers, but wisdom and patience. The Byzantine Empire and the dagger of betrayal. How Constantinople engineered the fall of the Second Crusade. Chapter 1, the wary heir on the Golden Throne. The young Emperor Manuel Comnenos, barely 30, sat upon the throne of Constantinople as news of Edessa's fall to Zengi struck like thunder. His fingers tightened around the golden-laid armrests as his steel-gray eyes studied the map before him. "They will come again like locusts," he whispered to his aged advisor John Axouch. Memories of the First Crusade's nightmares resurfacing, how the Crusaders had stolen Antioch from under his nose. That evening, as the bells of Hagia Sophia called for prayer, Manuel was sealing secret letters to Sultan Mehmed I of the Seljuks. "The wolves are coming. Let them pass so you may strike them in the desert." The hordes from the west. In May 1147, Conrad III of Germany arrived at Constantinople's gates with 20,000 men. From his palace balcony, Manuel watched the strange Frankish armies in their outlandish garb. "Look at them," he sneered to his ministers. "They think themselves saviors of Christendom, yet they're barbarians who understand nothing of our Orthodox faith." He ordered provisions for them, but secretly instructed his court, sell them food at exorbitant prices. Let them starve before crossing into Asia. The Anatolian ambush. At the Dardanelles, where Manuel formally received Conrad, he presented a gift, Byzantine guides to lead the Germans through safe Anatolian passes. But these guides, under secret orders, marched the Crusaders straight into the valley of Dorylaeum, where Seljuk forces waited in perfect ambush. Treachery! Conrad roared as arrows rained from the hills. German blood flowed in rivers between the rocks as Byzantine guides vanished into the chaos. Cat and mouse with the French. Months later, when Louis VII of France arrived, Manuel had refined his tactics. He welcomed the young king with such false warmth that Louis wrote home, "The emperor is a great and generous man." Yet Manuel played a deeper game. As the French crossed into Asia, they found bridges over the Meander River destroyed. Louis's men drowned by hundreds under Turkish arrows. In the command tent, General Theodore Mavrgon listened to the drowning screams with a sly smile. The Franks learned humility, he told his aide. The great deception. When Crusader remnants reached Antioch, Prince Raymond, uncle to Queen Eleanor, urged an attack on Aleppo. But Manuel sent secret letters warning Louis of Raymond's schemes. "He wants to steal your army," the Byzantine envoy whispered. The result? The Crusaders fractured instead of uniting. The slandered Damascenes. When Crusaders besieged Damascus, Manuel had already sent covert warnings to Nur ad-Din Zengi. "The Franks are starving wolves," he wrote. "They'll attack you then turn on your lands." This prompted Nur ad-Din to speed reinforcements while Crusaders quarreled over spoils before victory. Consequences years later, as Saladin besieged Jerusalem in 1187, a commander asked, "How did we win so easily?" Saladin gazed north toward Constantinople, "Because the Byzantines taught us to divide the Crusaders before uniting Muslims." History's forgotten lesson. In a derelict Constantinople palace, the aged Emperor Andronikos Komnenos read reports of Jerusalem's fall. Studying a fresco of Manuel, he muttered bitterly, "We won small battles, and lost the Great War." Here lay history's irony. By engineering the Second Crusade's failure, the Byzantines paved their own path to destruction by the Ottomans 3 centuries later. Their high walls couldn't forever protect them from the consequences of short-sighted betrayals. The rebel Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine in the Second Crusade, the queen who shook Europe's thrones in the Grand Hall of Château de Bordeaux overlooking the Garonne River, candlelight danced across the vaulted ceilings. Eleanor, at 23, raised her golden wine chalice with slender fingers. "I shall take the cross with the king," she declared in a voice that carried unmistakable defiance, as the assembled courtiers exchanged shocked glances. This was no mere queen consort making empty gestures. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, possessing lands and wealth surpassing those of her husband, King Louis VII of France. The warrior queen's procession on the morning of departure from Metz, Eleanor wore a leather corset inlaid with silver, a jewel-encrusted dagger at her waist. "This is no woman's attire," whispered a bishop disapprovingly. Behind her stood 300 Aquitanian knights in perfect formation, their red and gold banners fluttering. Her baggage train carried more than weapons, miniature libraries of manuscripts, musical instruments, and gowns more luxurious than any nobleman's. "She comes as if on a pleasure tour," grumbled a French baron, crossing into the unknown at the Rhine crossing. Eleanor's contingent faced unexpected trouble. The purebred Aquitanian chargers refused the wooden bridge. "Let her lead them across," a knight suggested. Without hesitation, Eleanor dismounted, took the lead rope of her white stallion, and guided it across, her long train trailing in the river's current. That evening, she transformed her pavilion into a courtly salon. As troubadours entertained the knights, Eleanor debated military strategy with her commanders. "She carries herself as the general, not the king," wrote one chronicler in astonishment. The Antioch scandal. In Antioch, Prince Raymond, Eleanor's uncle, welcomed them lavishly. From his seaside castle, Eleanor and Raymond pored over battle maps while Louis watched from the shadows. "Aleppo is the key," Eleanor insisted passionately. "Madness," Louis countered. "Jerusalem is our only goal." The rumors spread like wildfire, servants whispering of midnight garden strolls, laughter echoing from the castle towers. The court buzzed with scandal. Royal captivity. At dawn, Louis burst into Eleanor's chambers unannounced. "We march for Jerusalem today." When she protested, he snapped, "There is no we in war." Suddenly royal guards appeared, binding Eleanor's wrists with purple silk cords. "You are now a prisoner, my lady," came the quiet words as they carried her to a locked carriage, her furious screams fading into the Crusader camp's noise. Return in disgrace. Back in France, a transformed Eleanor stood before Pope Eugene III in Notre Dame. "I have witnessed how France's king treats Christ's champion," she stated coldly, demanding annulment. Within 2 years, she married Henry Plantagenet, the ambitious future King of England. One evening in the Tower of London, a lady-in-waiting asked, "Do you regret the crusade?" Eleanor's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "It taught me that men's constraints on women can be broken, with sufficient courage." Legacy of the rebel queen. 50 years later, as her son Richard the Lionheart led the Third Crusade, he carried Eleanor's lessons. "My mother taught us war is waged not just with swords, but with minds." Thus Eleanor became not merely a crusade participant, but a harbinger of changing times. Women stepping from history's shadows into the light of events. The fall of Edessa, the spark that ignited the Second Crusade. The bloody night of destiny. On that fateful Christmas Eve of 1144, as the Christians of Edessa prepared for their celebrations, the guards on the city walls spotted unusual movements in the plains beyond. "Just some stray cattle," one tried to reassure his comrades, but the truth was far more terrible. Imad ad-Din Zengi, the grizzled Turkish wolf, had massed a formidable army behind the hills. In his right hand, he clutched a message from a traitor within the walls: "The guards sleep, the gates unguarded." A savage smile crossed his face as he whispered to his commander, "By dawn, Edessa shall be but a memory." The fall that shook Christendom at daybreak, the citizens of Edessa discovered Turks slithering like serpents through a breach in the northern wall. Count Jocelyn too was away visiting Armenian allies, leaving the city under its aged bishop's command. "Save the women and children," cried the bishop as he tried organizing resistance, but the Turkish arrows showed no mercy. By noon, Edessa's streets ran red with blood as Zengi entered victorious upon a white stallion, raising his bloodied sword to the heavens, a gift for Islam on the Christians' holy day. The cry that swept through Europe months later, at Clairvaux Abbey in France, the monk Bernard read the letter that changed history. Edessa had fallen. His hands trembled imagining the atrocities. "We must act now," he said hoarsely, eyes burning with determination. In Rome, Pope Eugene III roared before the College of Cardinals, "The Turks have taken our first holy kingdom. Who knows, Jerusalem may be next." The fiery sermon come March 1146, thousands gathered on the hill of Vézelay in France. Pale-faced Bernard stood holding a wooden cross with trembling hands. "Behold, Christians! The Turks have defiled Christ's land. Who among you will take the cross?" Suddenly, King Louis VII rose from his seat and strode heavily to the platform. "I pledge my life to this cause," he declared. His wife Eleanor of Aquitaine followed immediately, raising a golden cross, "And I shall go with my husband." The hesitant emperor in Germany, Emperor Conrad III, consulted his advisors in his palace. Why sacrifice our lives for some distant city, he wondered. But when Bernard personally visited him at Christmas 1146, everything changed. The old monk stood shivering before the emperor. "My lord, when God asks, 'Where was Brother Conrad when my city fell?' how will you answer?" Tears fell into the emperor's thick beard. "I will not betray Christ." Legions of wrath. By spring 1147, all Europe was in motion. From France, Louis VII led 50,000. From Germany, Conrad marched with 70,000. Even simple peasants left their fields, sewing cloth crosses on their chests. In Constantinople, Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos watched this human tide with concern. "They come like locusts," he whispered to his counselors. "We must be rid of them before they devour our lands as in the First Crusade." Lost objectives. When the Crusader armies finally reached the Holy Land, they found Edessa too fortified under young Nur ad-Din Zengi's rule. "Why waste time on Edessa?" a noble argued at the war council. "Let us attack Damascus instead." In that moment, the Crusades' true purpose was forgotten. Instead of reclaiming the fallen city, they turned against a former ally. Lessons from disaster. Years later, as Saladin besieged Jerusalem, a commander asked, "How did their kingdom fall so easily?" Saladin gazed north toward Edessa. "They forgot why they left their lands. They fought for Damascus while their hearts bled for Edessa." Thus, Edessa's fall was more than the loss of a city. It became the wound that drove Europe to war, then the forgotten lesson that led to their defeat. The secondary campaigns of the Second Crusade. The shadow wars that reshaped the world. The Wendyish Crusade, Bloody Cross of the North. On a foggy summer dawn in 1147, Duke Henry the Lion gathered with Saxon nobles in Magdeburg. The air was unusually cold, as if heaven itself warned against their undertaking. "We shall not go to the Holy Land," the Duke shouted, raising his sword eastward. "Our Holy Land is here, where pagans defile our territories." Thus was born the first alternative crusade, shifting from Jerusalem's liberation to exterminating pagan Wendyish Slavic tribes. German soldiers painted crosses on their shields, yet their eyes lusted for fertile lands beyond the Elbe. The siege of Dobin. Before Dobin's formidable walls, German knights stood perplexed. Where are their treasures? A nobleman wondered disappointedly as Slavic peasants rained arrows from the trees. For 3 months, Crusaders besieged the fortress, but the Wends fought ferociously. One night, Slavic warriors infiltrated the camp, slaughtering sentries and burning supplies. "These are no ordinary infidels," a German monk wrote. "They fight as if demons possess them." Baptism or death. After the siege failed, Crusaders changed tactics. Instead of fighting, they offered tribal leaders suspicious peace deals. In a humiliating church ceremony, Wendyish leader Niklot was forced into baptism. Holy water dripped from his hair as his eyes burned silent defiance. "I'll embrace your Christ today," he muttered thickly, "but our gods will take vengeance tomorrow." True enough, months after Crusaders withdrew, Wends restored pagan worship, reconsecrating churches as heathen temples. The miracle of Lisbon. When Crusaders met explorers, the lost fleet spring 1147 found English and Flemish ships lost near Portugal's coast. Young King Afonso Henriques saw divine providence. "Why seek distant Jerusalem," he orated passionately, "when you can earn paradise here, liberating Lisbon from infidels?" Priest Gilbert of Hastings raised his crucifix, "God wills it." Bloody siege for 4 months, Crusaders and Portuguese besieged Lisbon's high walls. Muslim defenders fought valiantly while Christian ships blockaded supplies. Under a full moon, Crusaders built an enormous siege tower from ship timbers. At dawn, they stormed the walls crying Deus Vult. Betrayal and massacre. Despite safe passage promises, Crusaders swarmed the city like locusts. Not even children were spared, Muslim historian Ibn Sahib al-Sulla later wrote. Yet from this massacre emerged a new city. Lisbon became capital of nascent Portugal, Europe's gateway to the New World. Spain's forgotten war. Almeria's fall. Autumn 1147, Castilian armies stood before Almeria's mighty walls. King Alfonso VII, aided by Genoese sailors, deployed unprecedented trebuchets. Their stones were as large as bulls' heads, an eyewitness described. Within weeks, Almeria fell, Christendom's first Mediterranean port. Battle of Tortosa. December 1148, Count Ramon Berenguer IV of Barcelona led a strange alliance, Spanish knights, Anglo-Norman mercenaries, even German volunteers. They pioneered siege tunneling tactics. When walls collapsed, they surged into panicked Muslim defenses, but foreign crusaders soon departed, leaving Catalans to govern a predominantly Muslim city, an administrative nightmare. Secret wars against Byzantium. Constantinople's betrayal. Emperor Manuel Comnenos played a dangerous game. While crusaders fought in Anatolia, his troops harassed their supply lines. "Why aid those who may attack us tomorrow?" he coldly told advisors. Byzantine spies warned Seljuks of Crusader movements. Norman revenge. Roger II of Sicily, Byzantium's nemesis, seized his opportunity. His fleet sacked Corinth and Thebes, heart of Byzantine industry. "Take everything," he ordered. Especially silkworkers. Hundreds of artisans were kidnapped to Palermo, establishing Europe's first silk industry. Unexpected legacies. While the world focused on Damascus' failure, these secondary campaigns wove Europe's new destiny. Germany's eastern expansion began. Portugal emerged as a naval power. The Spanish Reconquista adopted Crusader ideology. Seeds were sown for the Fourth Crusade's Byzantine betrayal. These tectonic shifts originated from minor decisions by secondary leaders in what history deemed a failed crusade. Yet its eastern failure enabled Western successes, proving that sometimes, losing the battle wins the war. Internal conflicts among the Crusaders. The knife that stabbed the Second Crusade in the back. The warring kings. The ominous meeting at Regensburg in Emperor Conrad III's cold palace. King Louis VII of France stood trembling from both cold and anger. "We shall cross into Asia Minor immediately," declared Conrad in his heavy German accent, while Louis insisted on waiting until all forces were assembled. "He wants all the glory for himself," whispered a French noble into Louis's ear. In the corner, a German bishop muttered, "The French are cowards, afraid even of their own shadows." The disaster at Dorylaeum. Conrad crossed the Bosporus with his German troops without waiting for the French. In the plains of Dorylaeum, the Seljuks waited in a carefully laid ambush. "Where is the Byzantine support we were promised?" Conrad cried as he watched his knights fall one after another. That day, the Germans lost 9/10 of their army. When the French arrived weeks later, they found decomposing corpses and vultures filling the sky. The betrayal at Antioch. The ambitious prince in the lavish castle of Antioch, Prince Raymond, uncle of Queen Eleanor, welcomed the Crusaders with feigned warmth. "Why go to Jerusalem?" he said, twirling wine cups between his fingers. "Aleppo is the key. The Zengids' treasures await us there." Eleanor, who despised her husband Louis, enthusiastically supported her uncle. "It's a brilliant plan," she exclaimed as Louis flushed with anger. The imprisoned queen. On a dark night, Louis's guards entered Eleanor's chambers and bound her in chains. "Treason cannot be forgiven," Louis whispered as he ordered her forced removal to Jerusalem. Come morning, when the Aquitaine knights learned what had happened, they nearly revolted against Louis. "He has torn our army apart with his own hands," wrote one knight in his memoirs. The clash between locals and newcomers. The seasoned eastern barons at the war council in Acre, Jerusalem's Baron Melisende warned, "Damascus is our ally against the Zengids. Attacking them would be a fatal mistake." But the newly arrived European knights laughed mockingly. "Are you afraid to fight, my lords?" one said, banging his sword on the table. The doomed siege of Damascus. At Damascus walls, the locals deliberately weakened the siege. "The drought here is terrible," they told the newcomers, while secretly smuggling water and food into the city. After just 4 days, the Crusaders were forced to retreat. "Our allies have betrayed us," wept a German knight. The Byzantine betrayal. The two-faced emperor in Constantinople, Manuel Comnenos, played a dangerous game. While publicly receiving the Crusaders, he sent secret letters to the Seljuks. "I will let them cross, then you can pounce on them." The broken bridge at the Meander River. The French found the bridges destroyed. "This is treason," Louis cried as his men drowned under a hail of Turkish arrows. In that moment, he realized the Byzantines were his true enemies. Lessons from crushing failure. Years later, as Saladin besieged Jerusalem, one of his commanders asked, "How did we win so easily?" Saladin smiled as he answered, "Because they were too busy killing each other to fight us." Thus, the Second Crusade fell victim not to Muslim strength, but to betrayal, ignorance, and internal strife. It taught the world that unity matters more than numbers, and that an army divided against itself can never prevail. The Second Crusade. Strategic mistakes that changed the course of history. The Mad Death March through Anatolia. The most baffling decision in military history. In the palace of Regensburg, Emperor Conrad III gathered his commanders on a frigid winter night. "We cross into Asia Minor at once," he declared with overconfidence, while his advisors exchanged worried glances. "But the French forces haven't arrived yet, Your Majesty," Duke Frederick attempted to warn. "The French are slow as turtles," Conrad dismissed with a shake of his head. "We won't wait for them." The Dorylaeum trap. On the morning of October 25, 1147, the German army entered the narrow valley of Dorylaeum. The silence was eerily ominous. Suddenly, Seljuk arrows rained from all directions. "Betrayal!" Conrad cried as his Byzantine guides disappeared among the rocks. Within hours, the valley became a graveyard for 20,000 German soldiers. Blood flowed in the streams until they ran red as wine. The disastrous siege of Damascus. The fateful council at Acre in King Baldwin III's palace in Jerusalem. Crusader leaders gathered in tense anticipation. "Damascus is the key to victory," shouted a French baron. But Melisende, the aged lady of Jerusalem, shook her head sadly. "There are allies against the Zengids. This mistake will doom us all." Double betrayal. At Damascus walls, German knights noticed something strange. "Why is no water reaching us?" they wondered as local forces smiled slyly. By nightfall, some barons were seen sneaking into the city carrying precious gifts. "They're selling us out," cried a loyal knight. "Byzantine dirty tricks." The two-faced emperor. In Constantinople, Manuel Comnenos penned his secret letter to the Seljuk Sultan, "Let them cross, we'll be waiting for them with you." The severed bridge at the Meander River, King Louis VII stood stunned. "Where's the bridge?" he shouted. Suddenly, arrows rained from the opposite bank. "They're Byzantines." The French realized too late that their allies had cut the bridge. The Antioch family feud. The ambitious prince in his lavish castle, Prince Raymond, hatched his plan. "Attack Aleppo, and all Zengid territory will fall." He convinced Queen Eleanor of his strategy. The jealous husband King Louis, suspicious of his wife's relationship with her uncle, flatly refused the plan. "To Jerusalem at once," he ordered, then imprisoned the queen in a sealed tent. Crusaders against themselves. Locals versus newcomers. At the Damascus camp, veteran knights quarreled with new arrivals. "You're cowards," the Europeans accused. "And you're fools," the locals retorted. Poisoned waters. One fateful night, Crusaders found their wells contaminated. "They're killing us with our own hands." They realized too late that some locals had betrayed them. Lessons from defeat. Years later, Saladin sat in his tent listening to a captured German commander. "How did you defeat us?" the German asked. "We didn't defeat you," Saladin answered calmly. "You defeated yourselves with your own hands." Thus, the Second Crusade became a textbook case of how arrogance, ignorance, And infighting can turn a great army into a pile of corpses. Islamic resistance led by Zengi and Nur al-Din. How they crushed the Crusaders' dreams. Zengi, the predator wolf. The shock that rocked the Crusader world on a stormy December night in 1144, as the Christians of Edessa prepared for Christmas celebrations, Imad al-Din Zengi was plotting his decisive strike. "Today I will return Edessa to Islam," he whispered to his army commanders. At dawn, Zengi's forces stormed the city through unexpected weak points. "Treason! Treason!" shouted the guards as the Turks slaughtered anyone in their path. A bloody lesson the Crusaders would never forget. In the city's main square, Zengi ordered the execution of hundreds of Armenian Christians. "Let everyone know the price of resisting Islam," he cried as blood flowed like a river. These atrocities sent a deafening message to the Crusaders. A leader who knew no mercy had emerged. Nur al-Din, the mastermind. The brilliant Damascus plan. When the Crusaders besieged Damascus in 1148, the young Nur al-Din hid in the mountains with his forces. "Let them advance," he told his commanders with a sly smile. When the Crusaders became entangled in the city's narrow streets, he sprung the trap. Economic warfare. In Aleppo's palace, Nur al-Din met with his economic advisors. "I want to starve the Crusaders," he ordered. They burned crops around Antioch and cut trade routes. Within months, Crusaders were selling their armor for a loaf of bread. Innovative combat methods. Nights of darkness. On a freezing winter night, a group of Turkish fighters infiltrated a Crusader camp. "Allahu Akbar," they shouted as they slaughtered sleeping guards. These night raids became a nightmare haunting the Crusaders. Tunnel warfare. Under Harem Castle's walls, Nur al-Din's workers dug tunnels for two purposes: to blow up walls and to eavesdrop on enemy plans. Once, they heard a Crusader commander explaining his attack strategy. The next day, they were waiting with a perfect ambush, uniting the Islamic front. Eliminating traitors. In Damascus, Nur al-Din gathered scholars and sheiks. "Whoever isn't with us is against us," he declared. Then he launched a purge against all Crusader collaborators. Some were executed, others exiled to the desert by Maristans as secret weapons. Nur al-Din ordered the construction of huge hospitals in every city. "When Muslims treat their sick while Crusaders die of plagues, people will know where the truth lies," he told his advisors. Psychological warfare. Parades of shame. After every battle, Nur al-Din forced captured Crusaders to march through streets in chains. "Behold your heroes," he would shout at crowds. Then he would ransom them at exorbitant prices, draining Crusader treasuries. Heads on walls. At Aleppo's gates, Nur al-Din displayed hundreds of Crusader heads on spikes. "This is the fate of all who challenge Islam," he said coldly. The sight was so horrifying some Crusaders preferred suicide to capture. The legacy of victory. Years later, when Saladin entered Jerusalem victorious, he carried the same principles of Zengi and Nur al-Din. "They taught me war isn't just with swords, but with minds and hearts too," he told his soldiers. Thus, Islamic resistance transformed from scattered groups into an organized war machine, blending military might with strategic intelligence. They defeated the Crusaders not just on the battlefield, but in their minds and hearts first. The consequences of the Second Crusade on the Christian states in the East. The beginning of the end. The strategic siege. The ring of Islamic fire. In the majestic palace of Aleppo, Nur ad-Din Mahmud sat gazing at the map hanging on the palace wall. "They have left us a precious gift," he told his advisors, pointing to Damascus, which he had annexed to his kingdom in 1154. "Now the kingdom of Jerusalem is trapped like a rat in a snare." Nur ad-Din's armies moved like a venomous serpent, devouring city after city. By 1150, the Crusaders had no presence east of the Euphrates. "We have erased Edessa from existence," wrote the historian Ibn al-Athir. "Antioch now lies bare before our arrows." Slow death in the port of Acre, the Venetian merchant Marco lamented his fate. "Where has all the silk and spice gone?" he wondered, staring at the empty ships. Nur ad-Din had severed trade routes one by one. Even Christian pilgrims no longer came, fearing the Muslim bandits who spread like locusts across the roads. Economic collapse. The golden famine. In the palace of the king of Jerusalem, the nobles gathered in a dimly lit hall. "We have nothing left to pay the soldiers," the treasurer admitted, trembling. "Even the knights are selling their horses to buy bread." Outside, the markets were nearly empty. The price of a bag of wheat had risen to 10 gold dinars. "They are starving us deliberately," wrote a monk from the convent of St. Anne. They are killing us without war. New masters in the port of Tyre, the Genoese consul signed a new agreement. From now on, we have the right to 35% of all the city's trade, he read aloud. The local crusaders drank from golden cups, unaware they were selling their future. The shattered army knights without a battle in the castle of Tripoli. Sir William, one of the last remaining French knights, looked at his rusted armor. They all died at Dorylaeum, he whispered to himself. Who will defend the kingdom now? In the courtyard, Armenian mercenaries drank and gambled with dice. This is our army now, the local commander said bitterly. Thieves without honor. The betrayal of Constantinople in his lavish office, the Byzantine emperor read a letter from Nur ad-Din. We will not intervene to help you, he ordered his scribe to write. Let the crusaders pay for their arrogance. The spiritual crisis and angry goat in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the patriarch wept before the crowds. Why has the Lord abandoned us, he cried. The attendees raised their hands in prayer, but doubt had crept into their hearts. Outside, a mad monk screamed in the streets, it is God's punishment for our sins. We have become like infidels in our lusts. Internal division in the council hall of Tyre, local nobles clashed with newcomers from Europe. You understand nothing of this land. Baron Raymond shouted. We know how to coexist with the Muslims. The newly arrived German knights looked on with contempt. You are traitors and weaklings, they retorted as they prepared for reckless raids. The road to Hatin Nur ad-Din's legacy on his deathbed, Nur ad-Din whispered to Saladin, I have prepared the way for you. Jerusalem awaits you. Years later, Saladin stood on the same hills where Nur ad-Din had once stood, planning the decisive Battle of Hattin, the last army in the summer of 1187. The Crusader army gathered near the Sea of Galilee. They were mere shadows of men, starving, exhausted, divided. Where are the knights? Where are the supplies? King Guy of Lusignan wondered, looking at the crowds of peasants armed with sticks. When Saladin attacked, it was not a battle but a massacre. I saw knights collapsing from thirst, wrote one survivor. The sun scorched them as our arrogance had scorched our kingdom. The end of the Crusader dream. After the fall of Jerusalem, Richard the Lionheart stood on the shore of Jaffa, gazing at the sea. Had they not lost the Second Crusade, we would not be here today, he told his advisors. The Second Crusade was the beginning of the end. It exposed the fragility of the Crusader states and taught the Muslims how to unite. As the historian William of Tyre wrote, we sowed the seeds of our own destruction with our own hands. The absence of unified leadership in the Second Crusade, the chaos that shattered the dream of Jerusalem, the warring kings, the ominous meeting in Regensburg in Emperor Conrad III's cold palace, King Louis VII stood trembling from both cold and anger. We shall cross into Asia Minor immediately, Conrad declared in his hoarse voice, while Louis insisted on waiting until preparations were complete. He wants all the glory for himself, whispered a French noble into Louis's ear. In the corner, a German bishop muttered, the French are cowards, afraid even of their own shadows. The disaster at Dorylaeum. Conrad crossed the Bosporus with his German troops without waiting for the French. In the plains of Dorylaeum, the Seljuks waited in a carefully laid ambush. Where is the Byzantine support we were promised? Conrad cried as he watched his knights fall like flies. Days later, the French arrived to find rotting corpses filling the valley. If only we had waited and stayed together. Louis said in a broken voice, but it was too late. The Antioch scandal. The ambitious prince in Antioch's lavish castle, Prince Raymond, uncle of Queen Eleanor, welcomed the Crusaders with excessive hospitality. Aleppo is the key, he told them, twirling a wine glass between his fingers. The Zengid treasures await us there. Eleanor, who despised her husband Louis, enthusiastically supported her uncle. It's a brilliant plan, she exclaimed while Louis's face flushed with anger. The jealous husband. On a dark night, Louis's guards stormed Eleanor's chambers and bound her in chains. Treason cannot be forgiven, Louis whispered as he ordered her forced removal to Jerusalem. In the morning, when the Aquitaine knights learned what had happened, they nearly revolted against Louis. He has torn our army apart with his own hands, one knight wrote in his memoirs. The Council of Chaos in Acre. The fateful dispute in the King of Jerusalem's palace, the leaders gathered in an atmosphere charged with hatred. We must attack Ascalon first, shouted the local barons. No. Damascus is the target, retorted the newcomers from Europe. The young and inexperienced King Baldwin III looked back and forth in confusion. What should we do? He asked in a trembling voice. The siege of Damascus. At the walls of Damascus, the German knights noticed something strange. Why aren't supplies reaching us? They wondered while the local leaders smiled slyly. After just 4 days of siege, the Crusaders withdrew in defeat. Our allies have betrayed us, wept a German knight. The Byzantine betrayal. The deceitful emperor in Constantinople, Manuel Comnenos, wrote a secret letter to the Seljuks. Let them cross, we'll be waiting for them with you. The broken bridge at the Meander River. Louis stood stunned. Where is the bridge? He shouted. Suddenly, arrows rained from the opposite bank. They're Byzantines. The French realized too late that their allies had betrayed them. The catastrophic consequences. The rise of Nur ad-Din in Aleppo. Nur ad-Din read reports of Crusader chaos with a smile. They've handed me the kingdom on a silver platter, he told his advisors. The beginning of the end. Years later, Saladin stood on the walls of Jerusalem looking at the holy city. Had they been united, we could never have defeated them, he told his commanders. But they chose to fight among themselves, delivering victory to us on a golden platter. Lessons learned. The historian William of Tyre wrote at the end of his chronicle, we were not defeated by the Muslims, but by ourselves. The day we prioritized personal interests over the sacred goal, we lost everything. Thus, the Second Crusade became a historical lesson in how divisions can destroy the greatest of endeavors, and how unity is not just a slogan, but a condition for survival.